For this video, I want to talk about the subjects of political divisiveness, what we mean by that, civility in politics, and how these issues kind of relate to public discourse, that is, the engagement between politicians and the public, and I guess its effect on society would be factored into that as well. Now, I mentioned this, I thought would be an interesting thing to cover because particularly in the American presidential election, although we've seen it in the UK as well, but particularly with the American presidential election, a big overriding theme is this idea of civility and avoiding divisiveness. The Democrats and Kamala Harris have been very big on the idea of uniting the country together. The Republicans and the Trump campaign have very much been about the Democrats are destroying the country and we're the answer. I think divisiveness is one of those things that gets thrown around a little bit, and I've used the term. I think anyone who's sort of commented in politics has probably used that term at some point. But what do we really mean by it? I suppose if we take the word literally, it means a political figure, not always a politician. It could be a pundit on the news, a powerful pundit. I suppose by definition it means dividing people. But in a way, this is a little bit of a vague term because politics by definition is adversarial. So in reality, any politician who is honest about their positions and who takes a position is by definition divisive to an extent. I don't think any politician could be entirely unifying except in exceptional circumstances. So, for example, after Pearl Harbor, FDR would have had huge approval ratings. Immediately after September 11th, George W. Bush had, I believe it was 92% approval ratings. So there's rare occasions when presidents and prime ministers in the UK, perhaps more presidents because they're head of state, do generate a certain degree of unity. And how this relates to presidential greatness is a question of debate. As it stands, Roosevelt ranks as one of America's very greatest presidents. Bush is somewhere around the middle, in fact, the lower middle. Yet Abraham Lincoln, he was tasked with uniting the country during the Civil War. It's easy to forget that many Americans hated Lincoln at the time. They saw him as a dictator. He suspended habeas corpus. I do think he was a great president. I think he deserves that accolade. But it's easy to forget that in his day, Lincoln wasn't universally loved. Of course, he was martyred, and martyrdom always. Even forgettable presidents like James Garfield became hugely popular after their violent deaths. So that's something to factor in. Now, on this issue of divisiveness, most people would say Donald Trump is a very divisive figure, and I think he is. I do think he's a demagogue. I take back nothing I've said about him being a threat to democracy. The fact is, this is a man who refused to graciously concede defeat. He still refuses 4 years on. So to me, saying Trump is divisive doesn't sum it up. I think Trump is dangerous. This, of course, doesn't justify violence against him. And I would say with yesterday's incident in, I was going to say Mar-a-Lago. It wasn't actually Mar-a-Lago. It was another Trump venue, I believe, the Trump International Golf Course in West Palm Beach. I think that's separate from Mar-a-Lago. I've just been looking at a map of Miami, actually, to try and get my bearings of where exactly that was. Greater Miami, I should say. But anyway, it doesn't justify violence against Trump. Two wrongs don't make a right. I do think Trump has been largely responsible, not solely responsible, but largely responsible for pouring fuel on the fire. But, and this is an important thing, as awful as Trump is and as important it is that he is defeated, the Democrats cannot claim to be pure in this area. They can't. An example of this is in the George Floyd riots of 2020, American cities were burning. Trump wasn't technically wrong about that. They were burning. And the Democrats, I don't believe, done anywhere near enough to de-escalate tensions. I mean, Biden said if people are breaking the law, they'll be arrested. Good. But I would argue that years and years of identity politics in the Democratic Party and, frankly, turning a blind eye to violent crime. I'm not talking about gun crime because they've been good on that, but just generally violent homicide rates in American cities. They're not unlike the British Labour Party. There's this idea of identity politics matters more almost than public safety. I'm not saying the situation in Britain and America is exactly the same, and I'm not saying the Democratic Party and the Labour Party are exactly the same, but there are some parallels. I generally get a good impression from Harris. I think she's capable. The Republicans make a lot of her laugh. I think that's scraping the barrel, really. She's clearly experienced. The idea that people don't know her is she's only been vice president for 4 years. She had experience in California. I mean, she is more politically qualified than Trump was, but I don't get the argument that she's not eloquent. She's not smart. I mean, she's smart enough to have overturned the very poor ratings that Biden was having, within a very short period of time. That's no small thing to do in a presidential race. Time will tell if she's a good president or not, but it is glaringly obvious to me that she's the better candidate. It's just blindingly obvious. And I do think she is less of a polarizing figure than Trump. Now, having said that, the Democrats cannot be too... I don't think she is complacent, and I don't think her campaign is necessarily complacent, but I do feel that there is like all the talk of joy and optimism is all very well, and it has its place, but put it this way. Let's look at Springfield, Ohio. Now, that city, there's plenty of evidence out there to show that there are very real tensions there. And yes, Trump poured fuel on the fire by regurgitating that false story about Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs. But there are social problems in that city. You cannot have a relatively small place, population 58,000, have a sudden influx of migrants, I believe it's up to 12,000 Haitians or more, and not expect some tensions. This doesn't mean that all Haitians should be treated with fear and suspicion, but, it's going to create tensions. And I've just been watching Designated Survivor, if you're familiar with the series, it's about a relatively junior cabinet member, or 11th down the pecking order, suddenly becoming president, played by Kiefer Sutherland. It's a very good series. But one interesting episode is where he has a standoff with the governor of Michigan, who has directed state police to arbitrarily arrest Muslims, and this obviously is infringing on their civil rights. But I like the way it's written because it sort of shows the governor isn't portrayed as an evil man. He's just using his governor's office for what he believes is the right approach, keeping Michigan citizens safe. Of course, that's going to the point of infringing on civil liberties. Let's not forget, during the Second World War, Roosevelt ordered internment of all Japanese Americans. He didn't order the same thing for German and Italian Americans. But the point I'm making with this is that in Designated Survivor, President Kirkham, played by not Donald Sutherland, Kiefer Sutherland, is in Washington, thousands of kilometers away from Michigan. So it's all very well for Democrats in Washington to scoff at Trump and say, or on the campaign for that matter, Democrats on the campaign, to kind of say Trump's insane, he's a lunatic, he's spreading these conspiracy theories, and I think he is, but there are real tensions in Springfield, and, focusing so much on the cats and dogs story, I think can take away from addressing those very real tensions. I think in politics, there has to be scope for politicians to discuss controversial issues. And sometimes I think that when politicians do that, they're immediately accused of being divisive. But what's the alternative? The alternative is trying to please everyone, really. I do think like someone like Donald Trump, and there's others, he's probably the most famous example, but there are others who are incredibly reckless in terms of promoting conspiracy theories. I think that's beyond the pale. I think that's crossing a line. But let's take, for example, Islamist extremism. Now, Trump got a lot of heat for the Muslim travel ban, and I do think that probably went too far because it was collectively looking at all people from certain countries. Having said that, the left are deluded if they think that there isn't a problem with Islamist extremism, particularly in Europe. But North America is not immune from it. And what we've seen in Europe, what we've seen in Britain, is every time the issue of Islamist extremism is brought up, you get left-leaning people saying, oh, it's dog whistle politics, it's Islamophobia. And actually, the episode in Designated Survivor, fictional as it is, it's not an inconceivable sort of scenario in that situation. It's focusing on the city of Dearborn, Michigan, which has America's biggest Muslim population. And, the whole narrative they took was it's Islamophobia. But the point I'm making here is when you have problems in society, it's incumbent on leaders to talk about them. I think they should talk about them responsibly, but there shouldn't be this knee-jerk reaction of, we hear this in Britain, oh, it's dog whistle politics. That's a bit of a vacuous term, because I would respond, well, who's hearing the dog whistle? It's the people who are criticising that seem to be hearing the dog whistle. So as an example, for this country, I've been talking about America, I'd go back to Robert Jenrick getting heat for saying that the police should arrest those shouting Allahu Akbar on the streets loudly, right? But he was not talking about all Muslims, and he wasn't talking about that phrase being used in a private context. He was clearly talking about it being used in a very public setting. Now, my video on that, I've noticed I've got a lot of thumbs down, I guess, from left-leaning people or Muslims who assume that I'm endorsing some sort of Islamophobia. The thing is, I don't think it was Islamophobic. And I don't like that term anyway. I think it's weaponized to stifle legitimate debate. But if I could summarize this video, I guess it would be this. It's valid to criticize demagogues. It's valid to be very wary of someone like Donald Trump. I do think he's dangerous. But that doesn't mean that political correctness is productive. It doesn't mean that avoiding uncomfortable subjects in case it offends someone is the way forward either. So, for example, the Democrats have to take the concerns about immigration seriously. They have to sort out the violence in big cities. I think Harris would do well to do a big campaign tour of Arizona. It's a swing state, and at the moment Trump's leading it. She would do well to go to Arizona and really, really reach out to the people there and address their concerns and lay out what she's going to do about it. I do think, although I think she's more detailed than Trump is, and I think she's a much better candidate, I do think sometimes there's a lot of focus on her background. That's fine. People need to know who she is, but I think sometimes she needs to be a little bit more direct in her answers. I do think she could be a little bit evasive. I'm saying that, and I support her. I think she is a hell of a lot better than Trump, but I do think she needs to reassure people's concerns. Otherwise, those people might well vote for Trump. So, for example, she needs to be reassuring people in Arizona that the issue of immigration, her administration is going to take it seriously. It's questionable how much jurisdiction the vice president had on dealing with that issue, because Harris got a lot of criticism for not going to the southern border. Maybe she should have. Maybe that was a mistake. But I don't know if that's really the vice president's domain. I know that Secretary Mayorkas was the first cabinet secretary to be impeached in a very long time, earlier this year, being the Secretary of State for Homeland Security, so that would be his jurisdiction. So I've always believed that politicians have to have the courage to talk about controversial issues, and if that means being accused of being offensive, then that may be a risk that they have to take. For me, it's about how they do it, right? So Keir Starmer, I think, I question, for example, would he be prepared to talk about Islamist extremism by name? It's no good just saying we're against extremism. I want to see Starmer, because I think his party has a problem with this, be honest about this problem in our midst. It's good that he took a hard line with far-right agitators in the summer, and I support that. But there is other extremes in this country, and Islamist extremism shouldn't be ignored. I think it is a very serious problem in our society. We have had hundreds of people literally killed and wounded as a result of this ideology. So it has to be taken seriously. And by taking it seriously, I mean talking about the problem and not being politically correct about it and saying, oh, you can't talk about that, it's Islamophobic. That's really, to me, that's not courage at all. It's the opposite. So politicians have to talk about controversial subjects, and it may make them unpopular, but they have to do it in a responsible way. So it's a balancing act. And I think the problem with Trump is he doesn't do it in a responsible way. You know, Trump could have said, we have serious problems in this country brought about by immigration. People have legitimate concerns, right? And I'm going to address it, and, you know, what are my opponents going to do? Instead, he just latches on to a baseless rumour online. That is not presidential, and it's utterly irresponsible. I mean, I just don't think Trump should be anywhere near the White House, but that doesn't mean that some of the background issues are invalid. It doesn't mean that everything in Springfield is rosy. It's clearly not. And there'll be similar situations in other cities across the United States. So the Democrats can't just scoff at that. They have to take those concerns seriously, whilst correcting false information, of course. And they themselves, you know, frankly, have to be whiter than white. If they are exposed telling lies, then it's only going to increase cynicism in general. I'm going to wrap this up. I've been talking more about the United States in this one, but it very much applies to the UK as well. I don't think that politicians should have to shy away from talking about controversial subjects just because someone may be offended. I mean, another example, a mayor of London. I don't think a mayor of London should shy away from talking about the issue of black-on-black crime. It's a real problem. I just don't agree with this idea that because some people may be offended, it's therefore divisive and it shouldn't be spoken about. Because how is anything going to be done if issues cannot even be spoken about? That's the crux of the argument for me. The crux of the argument, I should say. So let me know your thoughts. I just think that politicians shouldn't be inflammatory, but that doesn't mean they should be overtly politically correct either. I think sometimes the best discourse is just the blunt truth, even if it offends people.